Unless you're completely making things up, you need to use sources when writing history, and this includes religious figures like Jesus. So what sources do you use to create a biography of a man believed by many to be the Son of God? The written sources for the historical Jesus can be divided into 4 categories. You have Christian sources, which can be divided into canonical and non-canonical sources, and you have non-Christian sources, which can be divided into Jewish and pagan. In this video, we're going to look at the Christian sources for Jesus, and then in part 2, we'll look at the non-Christian sources for Jesus. So, let's go! There are a surprising number of documents from the ancient Mediterranean about the life of Jesus, but they're not all reliable, or at least not all equally reliable. The biggest factor determining reliability is how close to Jesus' lifetime was the written source, and the oldest sources for the life of Jesus are in the New Testament. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, is it appropriate to use the New Testament as a historical source? Mythicists reject the use of the Bible as a historical source outright because that's kind of what makes you a mythicist. But people tend to believe that because the New Testament is used as a sacred religious text, it suddenly loses all validity as an objective historical document. But this is far from the case. I think this idea is a holdover from debates about the existence of God, where the Bible is not admissible evidence for God's existence. In a previous video, I mentioned that the Bible is not a single document, but rather a collection of documents that were assembled and had multiple different authors. Although today the books of the New Testament are used as sacred religious texts, they weren't necessarily written with that in mind. What you had were writers who wanted to record the life and deeds of their recently deceased Messiah in accordance with their community's traditions. They didn't know their works would be taken by others as the divinely inspired word of God at some point. So in respect to those authors, we should treat these documents the way they treated them, and then judge their merit from there. And the oldest sources recording the information about Jesus came from the epistles. If you're familiar with the New Testament, then you know that the Gospels usually come first. But that's only because early Christians wanted the New Testament to be organized by a chronological narrative like the Old Testament was. But in terms of actual age of documents, it's the epistles that are the oldest that we are aware of. The epistles are letters written to different early Christian communities across the Mediterranean, and scholars are uncertain as to who exactly wrote each one of them. And these letters address the issues that early Christian communities were facing. But they don't address the life of Jesus, at least not directly, but you can still tease details about him from those documents. For example, from the Pauline epistles, you learn that Jesus was a Jew whose primary audience was other Jews, and he claimed to be fulfilling Jewish messianic prophecies. We also see from the Pauline epistles that Jesus was believed by his followers to be descended from King David, which is a pretty big deal when it comes to Jewish messianic prophecy. And the non-Pauline epistles also give details like this as well. And most importantly, when addressing the Christ myth theory, the epistles emphasize the fact that these followers of Jesus believed that he was, in fact, a real flesh and blood human person who walked the earth in the not too distant past. The epistles are usually dated to have been written sometime between the 40s and 60s CE. These documents are very important for historians of early Christianity because they paint a portrait of what the earliest followers of Jesus believed about him. But if you want actual details about the life of Jesus, you need to look to the Gospels. The 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, can be divided into 2 groups. There are Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, and then you have the Gospel of John, which is all by itself. Now, those first 3 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels because they are all connected by common sources. The Book of Mark is believed to be the oldest of the Gospels, written sometime between 70 and 80 CE. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke both reference many of the same events in Mark, wording them in very similar ways. All 3 of these Gospels are believed to be looking at the same set of sources, referred to as Q. Why Q? Because Q is the first letter in the German word for source. This source, Q, is believed to be a set of documents and eyewitness testimonies that were available to the author of Mark, and possibly to the authors of Matthew and Luke. But they are long gone by now, and so we can't be 100% certain. And then there's the Gospel of John, which is believed to be taken from its own set of written and oral traditional sources, often referred to as J. While the book of Mark is dated to sometime between 70 and 80 CE, Matthew and Luke are usually dated to sometime in the 80s or 90s CE, while John is usually dated to sometime around 100 CE. Along with the epistles and the Gospels, there's also the book of Acts, which is believed to be written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. The book of Acts gives similar details about Jesus' life that you can tease out of the epistles of Paul. It is also noteworthy that the Gospel of Acts must have different sources than the Gospel of Luke. And we know this because the Gospel of Luke doesn't include the fate of what happened to Judas, the disciple that betrayed Jesus, but the book of Acts does. It should also be noted that the only other depiction of the death of Judas comes from the Gospel of Matthew, which gives a different account than Acts. For those putting together a biography of Jesus, this is important information, because it means that you don't have everyone building their stories of Jesus off the exact same pool of sources, meaning that there is far more evidence for his historicity than might be seen on the surface. And of course, there is the book of Revelation, which, although light on the details of the life of Jesus, is still important because its author is clearly writing about a person who is believed to have been flesh and blood. And it was written sometime between the 60s and 90s CE. That covers the canonical sources for Jesus, but what do the non-canonical sources of Jesus have to say? There are texts from numerous church fathers that write about Jesus, but the ones that interest Jesus scholars the most are Papias of Hierapolis and Quadratus of Athens. Papias was born around 60 CE, so he didn't know Jesus personally, but he did meet many of those who did, and so he compiled eyewitness testimony into his 5-volume work, Expositions on the Sayings of the Lord. Unfortunately, this collection of documents has been missing since about the late Middle Ages, but luckily, portions of it are quoted in numerous documents, most notably Eusebius's work on the early church history. And then there's Quadratus, sometimes referred to as the first Christian apologist. He wrote a letter to the Roman Emperor Hadrian defending Christianity and the miracles of Jesus, claiming that the people Jesus had healed or brought back to life were still alive by the early 2nd century. These works are usually used by apologists to defend the objective divinity of Jesus, but regardless of whether or not he was, we are clearly dealing with a pair of authors who were dealing with people who knew the real flesh and blood historical Jesus. Beyond the early church fathers, there's also the apocryphal texts, which were not selected to be put into the Christian Bible due to their heretical theology. And although not useful as a historical source for Jesus, they are useful in looking at the diversity of early Christianity. One of these texts that is sometimes cited is the Gospel of Thomas. However, it only talks about supposed secret teachings of Jesus, and on top of that, it was written sometime in the 2nd century, which makes it more useful as an example of how certain 2nd century Christian communities transmitted information than for any details about the life of Jesus. If you want to learn more about the Gospel of Thomas, I recommend you watch this video from the channel Religion for Breakfast, to which you can find a link to in the eye in the upper right hand corner. The Gospel of Thomas is often believed to be a Gnostic text, and to learn more about Gnosticism, I suggest you watch another video from Religious for Breakfast, also in the upper right hand corner by clicking the eye. The reason I bring up the Gnostics is because the mythicists have a strange fascination with them, and if you read enough of their literature, you'll find the Gnostics referenced almost as much as
I, Horus, Egyptian god of the sun.
And so, because the mythicists are so obsessed with the Gnostics, I feel it's appropriate to bring them up here. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into any more detail about them here because I'm going to have at least one video, most likely several, on the Gnostic Christian theories of the mythicists. There are other Christian sources about the life of Jesus, but most of them are written past the point of reliability as a primary source, and serve more as an intellectual history of a certain community than as an actual source for the life of Jesus. So now that we've covered the Christian sources for Jesus, in episode 3, we're going to take a look at what the non-Christians have to say. I would like to thank all of my patrons for helping make this video, and with a special thanks to my first executive producer, Leo Hockhauser. Thanks to your support, I can continue to make videos like these for everyone to enjoy. If you're interested in becoming a patron, then you can go to patreon.com/GrantHurst and see what perks you can get, such as getting your name in the end credits of videos or getting to see videos early. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.